Hi, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Sylvia and Peter talking about mental health. As you know, we are both practitioners, and this is a 10-minute break or thereabouts, where we have a coffee or a tea, and where you can do the same whilst you're listening to us, having an on the spot, unscripted, and totally relaxed conversation between two people who are practicing as therapists, who have been in the business world for a long time in different capacities and not always anything to do with mental health and mental poor health. But we were always both interested in the people we work with and their ability to function. And one of the things that we have been asked as a result of these conversations is actually, what is mental health?
Oh,
And how did people deal with mental health back in the day, previous generations? There's a lot of talk about mental health these days, and Sylvia and I are right now guilty of talking, but we are also out there every day doing. So what I've come across a lot in my own thinking about this is mental health has always been there. We know that it's the same as physical health. It has also always been there. But I believe that we have taken mental health for granted, simply not put any attention to it. We understand how much our bodies can deal with. And at work, there are health and safety procedures and tools and techniques and proper chairs and height adjustment here, there, and everywhere. So we understand we should look after our physical health. But we're taking our brains and our thinking ability, our mental capacity for granted. And suddenly, when it doesn't quite perform up to scratch and as expected, we have a problem. And it seems we're totally unprepared for it.
that's a really interesting concept there, Peter, because I'm just sitting here thinking, actually, yeah, I've experienced that where I look after your physical health. But have I in the past looked after my mental health? I've been in jobs where it's extremely demanding, extremely high pressure, extreme in all contexts. And there's been times when, times of huge spikes in demand and everything else. And the particular one I'm thinking about is when I was particularly demanding time, mind, brain, mental function, bang, 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 doing it. My physical body started to tell me otherwise. In the first instance I'm thinking about, I never listened to it. Second time, to your point, it's interesting because I always knew that my physical health was there to look after it. But was I aware about my mental health and looking after it? It just was always there. My mental health, my brain function, my decision making was always there without thinking about, I never really considered it. That's a really interesting point. It's just, did I take it for granted? Probably did, because it was always at my fingertips. Yeah. But it's just really interesting. Yeah.
It really is a conundrum, isn't it? Because it doesn't matter whether you're doing brain work or if you're doing manual labor, you still need your brain. If you work on a building site, putting bricks on top of each other, you cannot do that without this one functioning. And every industry, every profession has people in it who do need to be mentally up to speed, no matter whether they use their hands or their brains or as a main tool for doing what they're doing. But we just take for granted that you can cope with it. Then we go home and then we cope some more with family life, children playing up, being nice, something going wrong in our lives. We just expect to keep dealing with it. And then when we have a breakdown, oh, that's a weak person. How can he or she possibly not cope with this? I mean, we are expected to just carry on and carry on. And one of the viewers asked, well, how did people deal with these things in the past? And my initial response and reaction was, well, they didn't.
Oh, they did. And the age-old thing, it wasn't spoken about because, again, to your point, it was considered weakness, it was considered failure, it was considered, all sorts of things. So people didn't talk about it. Now, I do wonder whether the lifestyle was different way back then. They didn't have perhaps the pressures and the demands that we have in the current world, but we all still have a brain and mental function to different degrees. It's an interesting point because, you know, in my situation, I always know that my physical health could be affected. I could get injured. I could have an illness. But I never really think about my mental capacity because it's just always there.
People had accidents back in the day before you and I were born. People were struggling to put food on the table. We know that if our financial and social health isn't working, neither is our mental health, and typically also not our physical health. So there will always have been things. Go back to the First World War. They didn't have come back with PTSD, the soldiers. No, they had shell shock. We had terminology. I think a lot of people were put into institutions or just hidden away by the family if they were performing other than what would be deemed as within the norm. And I think sadly mostly ignored. But of course, the whole mental health provision and services within mental health have learned a lot over the years. We've researched, we've become more and more informed about how the brain works and what causes which problems. And because we know more, of course, there's more to talk about. And then all of a sudden we see all these problems popping up everywhere. But I don't think they are necessarily new additions. I think we've just become more aware of what they are, such as the 1 in 4 statistic, that 1 in 4 adults in the UK have experienced some kind of adverse childhood experience. We didn't know that before. We just saw people behaving strangely or was dysfunctional at school or in their relationships, but never understood that actually they were suffering from a past trauma.
Interesting because, you know, as you just said there, it was those phrases, oh, she lives on her nerves, that one, or that's always how he is. There was very little exploration as to what was going on behind that. You know, and in terms of the terminology, you know, we have the terminology, we have the definitions from the World Health Organization for what mental health is. We have definitions from all different bodies as to what poor mental health is. And I think a lot of it comes down to knowing one's own okay position. Let's use the word okay. I think that's quite sort of, you know, okay. Sorry about that.
It covers, it's an individual term. Yeah.
And I think that's, if, you know, because everyone's okay position will be different. So then if, you know, coming back to what is mental health, what is my okay position? What is your okay position? What is Fred or Susan's or, you know, Georgie's or Harriet's position? What is my okay position? Raising our self-awareness to that, and then raising that awareness to when that starts to slip. What are my signs? What are my behavior changes, my thought changes, my emotions, my feelings, my physiology? So then I can spot those signs, you know, so then I can start to recover those signs. So I think in the past, so many people might have seen those signs and given them a label. Oh, she's always like that, or he's always like that. And then that sticks, rather than exploring as the things could be better or changed. And I think that's where we have the opportunity now to raise our awareness in this day and age as to what is our okay position, so we then look after ourselves and others too.
And some might say, well, isn't that overdoing it a little bit? Isn't that over dramatizing things? But if you look inside and look at the brain, it is a totally complicated machine. It's an organ that does everything for us. It never stops. It's always on, as is our whole body, of course. It never stops doing what it's doing. But we are just expecting so much of the brain. And as you said earlier, well, maybe life today is more complicated, more hectic than it was before. And I think you're right. We have, as human beings, we're good at complicating things. It's innate in us. So we develop things, we invent stuff to make life easier, but also it gets more complicated at the same time. And we just expect to follow suit and just deal with it. We all know that our bodies need a break because our bodies tell us. You ache, you have pains, you can't run any further, you can't lift any more weights at the gym, or whatever it is you're doing. But we have got very good at ignoring when our brain says, you know what, I need a break.
Mm.
It's okay to not just motor on all the time.
Mm.
And we ignore that at work.
Mm.
We also ignore that at home. And I think if we can achieve a general greater awareness of our own signals and a greater acceptance of them and of the same signals in others, then we might get somewhere.
I think it's a great, you talk about things being complicated. Confucius, he says something along the lines of, things can be so simple, why do we insist on making things so complicated? You know, and I'm a great believer in keeping things simple.
Mm-hmm.
You know, what is my okay position? Ditching all the language, is it mental health, is it this and this? What's my okay position? Keeping it simple, keeping it real, keeping it human. So we can just all understand what that is. So we don't end up with labels. We don't end up just keep things simple, because we can overcomplicate things.
And
I
we do.
think also, you know, just by listening to this is taking a break. I know I'm taking a break with my coffee and having a chat with you, but also that there's that angle of just taking a break from stuff, and sometimes not overthinking things, less thinking, more doing. Yeah, because we can, by thinking and thinking and thinking, make things more complicated than they can be, as opposed to just getting on with it. And I think that's where sometimes the previous generation just did do that. For everything else, they just
probably did.
Yeah. So less thinking sometimes and more doing.
Absolutely. So why don't we stop the thinking and go and do some doing?
Indeed.
And hope that you have enjoyed this conversation. Those of you watching, thank you very much for that. And Sylvia and I will be back at another time at a screen near you, talking about issues in mental health and mental poor health. Thank you so much for watching. See you later. Bye.
See you later. Bye-bye.